The Talk Shop.
This is The Talk Shop on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader, and I am Masechaba Mushweshwe. We're looking at the rightful place of African culture in education. This forms one of our African affirmations brought to you by the Eskia Institute that we run daily right here on SAFM. And tonight we're talking about education. Afrocentric education is the kind of education designed to empower African people. A central premise behind it is that many Africans have been subjugated by limiting their awareness of themselves and indoctrinating them with ideas that work against them. This forms part of the teachings of the late Ndate Eskia Mpahlele. And to talk about the rightful place of African culture in education, we're joined by Mike Steinbank, who is the CEO of the Eskia Institute. We're also joined by Tami Ndenteni, who is the former head of SABC PBS Radio. And joining us on the line is Simpiwe Sasanti, who is an associate of the Eskia Institute and a journalism lecturer at Stellenbosch University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr.
Welcome. And welcome to you, Simpiwe Sasanti, also joining us on the line. Before we get into our discussion, let's listen to a quick clip, one of our African affirmations brought to you by the Eskia Institute, one that relates to the topic we're looking at tonight.
Gather, Africans. Come together, Africans. Let's listen to another African affirmation inspired by the life and work of Professor Eskia Mpahlele. Never before in the history of our struggle for freedom has it been more important than it is today for the black family to survive communal violence, civil strife, no matter who the instigators and agents are. In a sense, the family is under siege. Gather, Africans. Come together, Africans. Let's listen to another African affirmation inspired by the life and work of Professor Eskia Mpahlele. We need to free ourselves from the state of mind in which we see ourselves as groveling sinners, in which we constantly despise ourselves because we do not recognize God in ourselves. In 1982, when Eskia Mpahlele made this observation, many were grappling with the kind of education that would be ideal for black people, since Bantu education was rejected. Some wanted the same education as white people, while others were speaking of a people's education or socialist education, the latter being underpinned by ideological orientations. In the case of the first option, white people's education, that type of education was totally unacceptable to the likes of Mpahlele because liberated minds were not seeking to see black people being created in the image of white people, but rather seeking to affirm and celebrate Africanness. One of Africa's poets, Aim Cesar, noted that one of the most potent weapons in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. His point was that for as long as the thinking of the oppressed was determined by the oppressor stood no chance of being free, because the oppressed would always measure him or herself by the standards imposed by the oppressor. This was the case with Africans at the time. They were not very proud of their culture. There were few Africans who openly identified themselves with African traditional religions, since European colonialists declared African belief systems primitive and pagan. Educated Africans spoke English when engaging in intellectual discourse and adorned Western suits when attending important gatherings. When visiting traditional doctors, they did so secretly, since this was associated with primitiveness. Ngugi wa Thiong'o accurately described this double-standard living as Africans leading secret lives, and titled one of his books as such. The onslaught against Africans' belief systems continues. Circumcision, lobola, slaughtering in honor of the ancestors and other sacred rituals of Africans continue to be ridiculed in the media. Mpahlele's call to Africans is that they must defend their culture vigorously. In fact, he argues that the battle must no longer be pursued on the margins, but must be taken to the center. In schools, no longer must we have the teaching of Islam, Judaism, Christianity and other beliefs while excluding African traditional religions. They may not have been reduced to writing in the past, but it is no longer the case now. This challenge is to the educated who believe in African culture to claim space for African culture in the school's curriculum. Join us again every weekday at this time for another African Affirmation, inspired by the life and work of Professor Eskia Mpahlele and brought to you by the Eskia Institute.
We're focusing on this African Affirmation tonight, brought to you by the Eskia Institute, as we look at the rightful place of African culture in education. Joining us in the studio is Mike Steenbank, who is the CEO of the Eskia Institute. We're also joined by Tami Ndendeni, who is former head of SABC PBS Radio, and joining us on the line, Simpiwe Sasanti, associate of the Eskia Institute and a journalism lecturer at Stellenbosch University. Gentlemen, let me kick off with you, Ndate Steenbank, with regards to the rightful place of African culture in education. In essence, what is Ndate Mpahlele saying with regards to the place of our culture, the place of our traditions in the education that we are experiencing at the moment?
Well, let me try it in the context of what we're trying to do at the Eskia Institute in terms of the development of what we call an integrated arts and education curriculum. And in terms of that integrated arts and education curriculum, we're looking to absorb Ndate Mpahlele's teachings on the principles that undergird African humanism. And if you get into the principles that undergird African humanism, it starts from the premise, and in terms of education and certainly in terms of culture, it starts from the premise that we come from a history of oppression. We come from a history in which African culture, as that particular African affirmation asserts, that it has been subordinated for that of the colonizer, for want of another word. So, in that context, one of the principal things that emerges from Eskia Mpahlele's teachings in totality is that we've got to begin from the premise of self and knowing who we are as Africans in every sphere of our lives. So, I don't know if I've answered your question.
You have, and you talk about, the need to know ourselves. In previous discussions that we've had, especially around education, the issue of letting sleeping dogs lie, the history of our oppression coming to the fore. How do we deal with this in a society that is saying that it is moving forward as a rainbow nation, in a society that is saying we recognize what happened in the past, but we want to move on as one nation? And how realistic is this?
Thank you very much, Ms. Chaba, for inviting me and for participating in this program, which I consider to be an extremely important program. And the question you are raising is itself fundamental, because immediately you get into that question of our historical experience of oppression, you are then running the risk of being accused of blaming the past for your incompetencies. That you are incompetent and then you are blaming apartheid. You are incompetent, you are blaming colonialism. However, there is a psychologist in the United States of America by the name of Naim Akbar, who says that it is impossible. No, let me start off by saying, he says that, yes, when you go back into history, you open up old wounds. And it seems as if we are preoccupied with this digging of these wounds. And yet, you cannot ignore the past when the hand of the past continues to write in the slate of the present.
Exactly.
So, you see now, we cannot ignore this. And I think, if you give me a minute or so, it's important to take note of the fact that even the framing of this affirmation by Mpahlele take notice that there's an emphasis on negative values, an emphasis of groveling sinners, an emphasis of despising ourselves and not seeing God in ourselves, which therefore suggests that something has to be done, a certain kind of purification and cleansing. Later on, I will come back because Frantz Fanon addresses himself exactly to some of these questions that Ntate Mphahlele is addressing.
I love the fact that you bring up the issue of purification and cleansing, because I'm sure this has some of our listeners going, oh my goodness, there he goes talking about traditions and cultures, and these are things that we've moved away from, which is something that Ntate Mphahlele touches on as well in this focus on a people's education. I'd like to bring in Usimpiwe Sasanti and just ask from you, what is your understanding of a people's education? What are we talking about, and how do we move forward with regards to this, a people's education?
Thank you very much, Sam. Let me begin by saying that, just now you mentioned that people are saying that we've moved on from traditions. Tomorrow, the world over will be celebrating what is called Valentine's Day. People will be holding flowers and exchanging kisses. The truth of the matter is that if you look back into the history of that, it is a Roman tradition. When a particular man, I think it was Saint Anthony, he would run around and pet people on the backs and all that, with the belief that those who are infertile are going to be able to be productive. Today, when people are walking down the aisle, there's a father who's holding her daughter and handing over the daughter to the husband. The significance of that is historical. That's what the white people used to do in Greece. Now, the daughter is being owned by the father, and the father is now transferring ownership of the daughter to the husband, one human being owning the other. Now, that is a very oppressive kind of a culture, but it is practiced to this very day when people are, celebrating what is called the white wedding. We call it the white wedding, and we're so black. And even then, while we call it the white wedding, we participate in it because we're suffering from what Ntate Mphahlele has called the disinherited imagination. Meaning that we are no longer thinking through our own heads. Others are thinking on our behalf as Africans. So, what kind of education are we speaking about? We need to understand that education is not value-free. Education is value-laden. So that, therefore, the kind of education that is pervasive to this very day, our children are being exposed to philosophy. And this philosophy is not neutral. It is Western philosophy. You learn about Plato, you learn about Socrates, you learn about Foucault, as if there is no Eskia Mphahlele, as if there is no Cheikh Anta Diop, as if there is no Theophile Obenga, as if there is no African philosophy to speak about. We are being taught to be strangers to our own selves. It happened in the time of colonialism. It continues to happen to this very day.
Earlier on, Ntate Ntanteni spoke about a purification and cleansing, and this ties up with what Ntate Mphahlele talks about when he says that we have declared Yes, it was colonialist at the time, but even today we have declared African belief systems primitive and pagan. So, Ndate, when you talk about purification and cleansing, Ntate Ntanteni, what exactly are we looking at?
Thank you very much. You see, earlier I spoke about these negative values, and I said Frantz Fanon captures this because this is how we have been socialized. Simpiwe says education is not value-free. This is how we have been socialized. A certain mindset has been instilled in us or introduced in us through the system of education that we've gone through. When I was at school studying history, I read about Bismarck, unification of Germany. I read about Mazzini, unification of Italy. I read about all these European heroes, and therefore they became what was my role model. At no stage did I learn about Nkrumah. At no stage did I learn about Nyerere. At no stage did I learn about Lumumba. They were non-existent. Now, coming back now to these values, Fanon mentions the thinking behind this education that we're giving. And he uses the words that Africans or the native is described as lacking in values. Lacking in values. But he is not only just, by the way, I'm using you in a very generic sense, not in a sexist way. He is regarded as not only just absence of values, but inimical to values. He says he is the enemy of values. He is the quintessential evil, the corrosive element. And therefore, what has happened is that we have imbibed this kind of education and we have adopted a negative attitude and a negative view of ourselves. We've spoken so much, or much has been written and said about the evils of the apartheid system, the violence, the deaths, etc. But there isn't a place where there has been an interrogation of the psychological impact that we have suffered from. And it was not an accident. Verwoerd says, do not teach the African child mathematics or physics and expose him to greener pastures over which he may never be allowed to graze. We will educate this child only to be able to rise above or to occupy certain levels of labor. It was a clear designed policy. Now we are sitting here. Has there been any, I'm coming back to the cleansing part of it, you see, has there been any kind of education where we have interrogated all of these things and said to ourselves, hey, we don't seem like we're normal. We need, I'll come back to this a little bit later on, because you see, this ties up. You need to look at it from a universal perspective. Ngugi addresses himself to some of these questions, and he calls it a cultural bomb. I'll come back to that a little bit later.
I want to talk about the interrogation of what has happened to us. Are there platforms that are provided? Are we as a nation on the same page with regards to how we need to purify and cleanse ourselves, as Ndati Tami Ndendeni has said? We're talking about the rightful place of African culture in education, and please be a part of our conversation. Give us your take on 0891 104 207. The number is 0891 104 207, or SMS us on 34701, and SMSs are charged at R2. This is the Talk Shop on SAFM with me, Masechaba Mushweshwe, South Africa's news and information leader. SAFM bringing you African Affirmations, brought to you by the Eskia Institute every weekday right here on The Talk Shop. Well, tonight we're interrogating one of the affirmations, the rightful place of African culture in education, and we're joined in the studio by the CEO of the Eskia Institute, Mike Steenbank. We're also joined by the former head of SABC PBS Radio, Tami Ndendeni, and joining us on the line is an associate of the Eskia Institute and a journalist lecturer at Stellenbosch University, Simpiwe Sasanti. We are taking your calls, questions or comments on the rightful place of African culture in education as articulated by Ndade Eskia Mpahlele on 0891 104 207. The number is 0891 104 207, or SMS us on 34701. SMS number is 34701, and SMSs are charged at R2. I'm taking a look at some of the SMSs coming in from you. Here's one that says we are dependents of the masters, and another SMS, this one coming in from Mel, talking about you now then also want these African educated folk to compete in a modern world. Let's talk about this. This is an issue that comes up all the time. Every time we talk about an Afrocentric education system, when we talk about an education system that is based on African values and traditions, immediately the issue of competing in the modern world, being part of a global economy, comes into play. How do we answer to that particular question? Mr. Steinbeck?
Well, it's strange that your caller should say that, because notwithstanding everything that we said, Africans are coping very, very in fact, running a great part of this modern economy that you're talking about. So I don't quite understand where that question is coming from. There's no, it's a disjoint. It's got no meaning.
Ndati Santini, you wanted to come in?
Yes, please. To the contrary, Mike, I fully understand where that question comes from. Because the premise upon which, when someone speaks about the international world, you will understand that sadly what is being referred to is the Western, or rather the European and the American worlds. When someone is speaking about international law, that person is talking about European law. In the same way, when things negative are spoken about, they'll say specifically Africa. But look at the European war. They call it the World War, the Second World War, because it has got negative connotations. Now, when someone speaks about modernity, our question must be, who determines what is modernity? Right now, we're speaking through the English language, right? It is not an accident of history. It is a result of imperialism that we're not speaking an African language amongst ourselves, but speaking English. We're learning through European lenses. Everything that we do, when our politicians are going for important conferences, they put on ties and European suits, right? So those are all Western standards. We're operating on the basis of capitalism, which is an insult and flies in the face of Ubuntu. For instance, over the weekend, the Minister of Health, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, was speaking about how, if someone goes to a private hospital and this person does not have a medical aid, this person will not be treated. That is cruelty. Ramosa Makgoba reminds us in his book, African Philosophy Through Ubuntu, that when Africans, on the basis of African philosophy, are confronted with the choice of aiding a human being or gaining profit and losing that profit, the choice inherently, according to African philosophical tradition, is that you must aid the human being and ignore the profit. But the profit motive is the other way around. So the basis upon we're operating in this world is Eurocentric, is Western, and therefore when we're speaking about Afrocentricity and speaking about African humanism, we are rejecting, as Bantu Biko would say, that kind of premise which gives preference to material over a human being. And so that, therefore, there is no neutrality on this issue. And we are saying that as Africans, we've had our hands tied behind our backs, and we're expected to compete. When our hands are freed, we're expected to move around in the circles that have been already set by others. And Afrocentricity says no.
Do we have the platforms provided to talk about these particular issues, to say and to define what circles we will be moving around in ourselves? You spoke about an interrogation of self, of trying to find who we are as Africans. Yeah. Is there this space? Because you're seen, the minute you bring this issue up, you're seen as being against, social cohesion in our country.
Well, the point was made earlier by Bratami when he was speaking about the issue, and I don't know where other South Africans thought about it, but the way we thought about it was, come 1994, the expectation was a complete change in the education system, not an adaptation of the old education system. And it's virtually impossible to adapt that colonial education for our circumstance. And if you look at our education, certainly looking at my children's school books and stuff, there's no change in terms of the education system at all. And those African values that we're speaking about here are not being instilled in our children. So,
you wanted to come in as well.
Okay, thank you very much. You see, when you raise the question of the platform, it raises so many other questions, because to start with, do we accept that there is a problem? If we don't accept there is a problem, we think everything is fine, we are the Rainbow Nation, then you would not be able to answer the question of whether there is a platform, because there's no acceptance of the problem in the first instance. First and foremost, we need to zero in on the problem, because we are seeing the world through the eyes of somebody else. We are pursuing an agenda that was imposed on Africa when Africa was divided in the Berlin Conference in 1884. You have a situation today where then and now, African countries, yesterday Zambia was playing against Cote d'Ivoire. We're defining our countries in terms of European languages. Cote d'Ivoire, French-speaking Africa. Yeah. Zambia, English-speaking Africa. And so there is a conflict already. And that conflict of Anglophone, Francophone, finds expression. Remember, there hasn't been able to sort out the problem of the chairman of the African Union, of the African Union, because the Francophone countries are voting differently and the Anglophone are voting differently. Now, I said earlier that I want to come back to this question, which Ngugi calls the African bomb. What we're talking about the unleashing of this bomb on a daily basis. And what it does, it annihilates an identity of self. We become inimical to that which is in the best interests of our people. We begin to embrace certain values and certain cultures which are not in the best interests of our people. How would you account for the fact that we have a situation where so many people are dying on our roads? And the reason is partly given as South Africans are intolerant. Why is it that you find husbands killing their wives and their children and turning the guns on themselves? Ngugi says we have a collective death wish. Eskia says we despise ourselves because we don't see God in ourselves. And therefore we behave in ways that are not in our best interests. And we don't understand why it is that we are behaving in this way, because we have not gone back to our past. We are content, we are happy to say we live in the Rainbow Nation. What Rainbow Nation? Whose reality, whose agenda are we pursuing? What is our own reality? So when you come to this question of competing in the modern world, Simpiwe, hello, I didn't greet you, my brother.
That's a bit late in the day.
Yes. But it's just that I want to refer to you, my brother, and I don't think I have the right to refer to you without having said hello. Come up. You see, Simpiwe says, who defines this modern world? This globalization that we're talking about, there is a tendency to speak about the system of capitalism as if it has no failures. And yet, the history of the system is littered with failures. Right from 1929 with the Great Depression, unemployment, poverty,
to the recent economic
economic crisis. And then you tell me You tell me about competing in the modern world. I say, hey, wait a minute. What are you talking about?
I want to talk about the secret lives that was also articulated, because when we are, and this is what we do as Africans, when we're amongst ourselves, we articulate and recognize that there's a problem. But when we get into South African company, it seems that we talk a very, very different language in terms of how we think we can assimilate ourselves into present-day society. I want to talk about that, but let's take some calls. We've got callers, listeners wanting to be part of this conversation. Duduza in Cape Town, good evening to you and welcome.
Good evening, and thanks a lot for the privilege.
Thank you for calling in, sir. And
greetings to the elders there in the station.
Hello there.
And first and foremost, I would love you to assist me with their contacts after they've gone.
Okay, we'll give out the contacts for the Eskia Institute in Dati. What's your take on the issue on the table, Duduza?
My issue on the table, I was once listening to the Metro, the SAFM, and there was some discussion about African indigenous knowledge systems. So the callers were calling like they were intimidated, calling that no, it's supposed not to be like that you're talking about this, you see, something like now you're separating this from that, you see. Which is, for me, I found like strange, because the whole global community owes their knowledge to the African continent. And that is language. They owe to African continent astronomy from the ancient Kemet, the Egypt. Mathematics comes from Egypt, the ancient manuscripts from Ethiopia, Bible is ours, everything is ours, the healthy lifestyle, culture comes from Africa. So there's no fighting against anyone, but trying to train and give character to an African child. Listen, there's no threat to anyone. It's not like this fighting against anyone, but it is vital for the people of Africa to know their roots.
Duduza in Cape Town, thank you so much for the call. And I appreciate you saying we're not fighting against anyone, because unfortunately, when we bring up issues around Africanism and African empowerment, immediately it looks like you're attacking other groups, you're attacking certain people. Simpiwe in East London, good evening to you and welcome.
Good evening, ma'am. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
I'm good. Mr. Susant, you disappeared from the screen. I hope you remember me. Yes, that's lovely.
Clearly that laugh says a lot.
Ma'am, I don't know, the previous caller I think took a lot of my thoughts, but I just wanted to check, because I got only a glimpse of the discussion. I didn't listen to the whole discussion. My question is that at what level do we pitch this? How far down do we go with our education system? I take my kids, I've got two boys who go to an English medium school because it's close to my home. It's got facilities, and I look at the composition of the teachers. 80% of the teachers that teach my kid are white. Now, where do we take our kids so that we don't have the fear, and we have a way of instilling, I think, the discussion we're talking about at very early stages?
Nice one. Thank you so much, Simpiwe in East London. We'll get Dadin is raring to respond to you, but let's quickly take Pumlani in Mthatha as well. Pumlani, good evening to you and welcome.
Good evening.
Hello, Dad.
Okay. I'd like to contribute to the issue of interrogation of identity. Look, we are fighting a very big beast here that has been entrenched in our systems. For example, even our language, when things are going well, they would say "Ndozimhlophe." You find that when things are going bad, it's "Ndozimnyama." And issues like, you'll find all sorts of languages like the black market, black magic, and so on and so forth. Now, you ask yourself, are those things accidental, or have they systematically been put to be so? That's open for another debate.
Okay.
Another issue that you'll find that even with our kids, you find the dolls that they play with. What color are those dolls? And what psychological connotation that comes then to their minds?
Okay. Pumlani and Mthatha, thank you so much for the call. Let's just quickly go back to the issue that was raised by Usimpiwe around resources and facilities in the English medium schools. You wanted to come in, Dadin.
Yes, I just wanted to address myself to this question of education. Which school do you take your child, etc. I think that's part of the problem. We seem to understand education within the context of a formal institution, a formal setting, a school. And that is not. If you go back to African culture and society, we had institutions of learning. We had education. So the education of the child starts from birth. Yes. And this is not only just African society, it's society throughout the world. Because when we speak education, we are talking about empowering the young child to grow up knowing that which society has achieved and that which we are going towards, so that the child doesn't start as a tabula rasa. What distinguishes us as human beings is the fact that we are in a position to refer back to our achievements of the past and grow on those achievements. That is the process of education. When you go to a formal institution, that is where this is supposed to be reinforced. But the question is, what kind of education are you getting from that institution?
And talking about institutions, let's bring in someone who's at an institution, journalism lecturer at Stellenbosch University, Ndata Sasanti. Let's bring you in.
That's a very good one. I'm going to be very frank about this. I'm teaching in a predominantly white environment. Now, I was teaching African culture to my journalism students, predominantly white. And then I was speaking about my experience of being Igqigha, right? And I was telling them that I was taken to the river kingdom where my ancestors spoke to me. And I saw many things. This student came to me and said, "Sir, please, don't speak again about that devilish thing. I had nightmares." And I said, "Hey, listen, please. I fully understand what you're saying. And but listen, look at me. I'm an African as they come, right? And I bear witness to my living reality. And so I'm going to speak about that experience, which is African. In the same way, if a priest were teaching Christianity, would bear witness, or an imam teaching about Islam. And so, when you come with Africanness in a predominantly Eurocentric environment, the reaction is that of shock and horror. And, this student was saying, how can it be that you're so educated, you're teaching in this institution, and yet you're speaking about this primitiveness? So going back to what you were saying, Sisi, earlier on, Stephen Bantu Biko drew our attention to what is referred to as integration and assimilation. Integration is the coming together of equal forces. But assimilation is when one force is being swallowed by the hegemonic force. Taten Teten was saying that education begins at home. I struggle with my own children. I teach them to be proud Africans. But I'm telling you, when I was going there to get my PhD, I was wearing imbola. You know what imbola? This red ochre over my cloth. I was walking barefooted. I was wearing the insimbi, the beads. Hey, my children were horrified. My little daughter, when I was taking her to school the other day, wearing a mipato. Saying, "Daddy, please, you must not come close to school because you're embarrassing us." So the point that I'm making is that why is my child a stranger to herself? It is because normality is defined and premised on white standards. Even though at home she's okay that her daddy can do a Igqigha stuff and his Igqigha stuff and all that, but when he comes to the modern world, to the civilized world, Daddy must not bring this to the fore.
The secret lives that we were talking about.
The secret lives that we were talking about. So the point is that we are not going to win this war until, as Ndate Mpahlele was saying, that we must move the battle to the center. Sisi Mashaba, we are fighting. I'm not apologetic about the fact that we are fighting. If people of other nations feel that, we have a right to fight because we are being fought against. Lord, let me conclude by saying, Utingan, whatever mistakes he has made, when he was getting together these four trekkers, he said that I'm going to say, asibulala abathakathi. Abathakathi are witch doctors. Africans have been bewitched. That's what Dingan recognized. And so that this cleaning and exorcising must take place, we cannot speak nicely about this. We can't afford to.
I want to take Malisa Tsani in Bloom, and then I'll come to you in Data Steinbank. Malisa Tsani, Dumel.
Dumelo Chaba.
How are you in Data?
I'm fine, and how are you?
Very well, thank you, sir.
Yeah, I want to start off by saying that I'm very proud of you, Osmat Chaba, for one reason. The manner in which you speak to people, especially those that are older than you are still able to put, those words of respect like in Tate, Avuti, Ausi. A lot of people, especially when they feel they are successful, they no longer do that. So really keep it up, and I hope that many people can learn from you. Now, let me get to the point. My point is one, we have attached so much value to material achievement. That's basically how we have come to define our livelihood, our success, our excellence. If you can look at people who have graduated who've got certificates, even if they are not educated, because there's a difference between being educated and being certificated, you find that someone, let me say I get promoted, I'm working in the audit industry. And I lead people in my department who are older than me. By virtue of having more certificates than they do, suddenly I'm no longer able to refer to them or talk to them with respect. Because according to me now, what differentiates between the two of us is not a matter of age. It's now a matter of what lies in the certificate and in my bank account.
Okay.
Which has become our problem, which has become something that is defining the manner in which we live as Africans. If we can move away from the pressures that we put on young people as communities, that you've got to seem to be driving a particular car, to be living at a particular place in order to be assessed as successful. I believe that we may move a step or two towards regaining our self-consciousness as Africans.
Okay,
because I believe respect is the biggest thing, and culture is the biggest thing. Smart Chaba, while I was studying, I was very much confused at some point, because I was amongst a lot of people who would go attend SCO. Suddenly a person is a born-again Christian. Even if back home where they come from, they never, practiced those religious aspects. But suddenly a person is a born-again Christian just to fit in.
Okay, I hear you. Malisa Tsani in Bloemfontein talking about some of the ways that we assimilate ourselves into the cultures and traditions that we find ourselves being in. I have an SMS that comes in, and I'd like this address. It says, I assume you're all wearing traditional clothing with no cell phones in your pockets. Not everything from whites was wrong. You don't mind taking the cream, do you? And another SMS says, I think we are hypocritical. We don't defend Africanism ourselves. We front it. And MDD says maybe we later have to talk about the psychological warfare that is apparently underestimated by most victims. This issue of what we're wearing, the language that we're talking in, comes up each and every time. Hold that thought. We're going to come to it just after this.
The Talk Shop.
This is the Talk Shop with me, Masachaba Moshweshwe, on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. And my goodness, what information we are imparting and dealing with tonight. We're talking about the rightful place of African culture in education, one of our African affirmations brought to you by the Eskia Institute. We have run out of time, gentlemen. I'd like to just quickly touch on something that Phumlani Mthatha spoke about. Yeah. He says this is a huge entrenched problem. Yeah. Does this mean that we cannot resolve it?
I've been dying to address Phumlani's question, and Phumlani speaks about about taking his child to a school where it's a predominantly white teachers, etc.
That was Simpiwe.
Or was it Simpiwe? I've been dying to address that in the sense that of saying that he asked the question, what do we do? And my answer to that question is that we agitate for an integration of African values in our schools.
Get on the SGBs, be active.
And you have to agitate for the and as Brand Tami said just now, we recognize that there is a problem. And if we recognize that there is a problem, then we can agitate to have this introduced into our schools. The exact same point that we're talking about.
All right. Didn't any 20 seconds.
Okay, fine. Thank you. You know, if I can say this, I don't know, in 20 seconds. I want to give an example of a Nigerian who got his PhD he wrote his dissertation on Hegel's philosophy of religion. And he was then approached by another clergyman to say, can you please teach African philosophy? He said, there's nothing like that. And let me just conclude this. When he was corrected and he went and did his own research and re-educated himself about African philosophy, he wrote a book. And that book is called